He's published on Russian politics, Russian foreign policy. He is the editorial board of the annual edition. Some of you are familiar with those. The American Foreign Policy and Comparative Politics editions. And he is here to talk to us today about Russia and Ukraine, the roots of their conflict. And please join me in welcoming direct from Russia this morning. He left Russia this morning, believe it or not, Russia, New York, which is where he lives. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nate Dixon.
Thank you very much. It's terrific to be back at Colgate. I taught here for a semester and a half. I was filling in. Guess for no one. You were in between Russia specialists, so I did teach here, and I'm very pleased and very happy to be back. And it's true, I live in Russia, New York, which is about an hour north of here. Okay, so it's a little bit hard for me to get back into thinking about Russia because, as we all have, I've been thinking about events in Paris last few days because I also live in France half the year. I teach in the fall in the classroom, and then I teach online from France, teach my courses online from France, and so the events recently have been taking a lot of my free time and thinking about it. But I'd like to today focus on Russia and Ukraine, which of course was in the news quite a lot, but seems to have been overtaken by other events, and we don't hear so much about it anymore. I'm going to give you a rather, I don't want to say unpopular, but not the conventional wisdom of this conflict, or the roots of this conflict, which many people blame Russia for. So let me move on and get right into it. Okay. Okay. Russia and Ukraine, especially the people of eastern Ukraine, are just about the same people, nearly the same language, same culture, same historical traditions. While Western Ukraine's a different story, Eastern Ukraine is pretty much the same. I want to focus on the big picture here for the moment, and that is that Russia and Ukraine have been together for about 1,100 years and apart for about a quarter of a century. Ukrainian independence briefly after World War I, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's about it. And if we go back in time, they have been together for a very long time. And I think this is important to understand so that we can understand the Russian perspective on what has happened. Okay? Very quickly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the Russian state was founded in the 9th century in what was called Kiev Rus, between the Black Sea in the south and the Baltic Sea in the north. If we look throughout Russian and Ukrainian history, you will see that Ukraine is, or was throughout Russian history, Ukraine is, right here is Ukraine right there. It was part of the Russian Empire from, ever since the Russian Empire was an empire, basically. Post-World War II, post-World War I, you'll see on this map here that Ukraine here is not a part of the Soviet Union here. And you'll notice where its border is about in the middle Romania, and that's an important consideration. In 1924, the Soviets reincorporated Ukraine into the Soviet Union, so now it is here, part of the Soviet Union. I should say by 1924. It was actually a little bit sooner, 1920, but the map date is 1924. Okay? Now, part of the problem that has occurred in the last couple of years is a result of the Soviet Union pushing the borders very far to the west and rearranging the borders after World War II. What the Soviet Union did was to basically extend the borders of Ukraine, Belarus, and other areas at the expense of Poland and other countries here. Now it borders the Czech Republic, borders Hungary, so that they can easily control these territories. And as a result, they push the borders of Poland to the west, and they push the borders of Germany to the west. And now you see that Ukraine is no longer here, it is border with Romania, but all the way over here. Okay? So they push the border very far west. Okay? Just how far were they? Lviv is the main city in the western part of Ukraine, where you can buy something like this, toilet paper, with Mr. Putin's picture on it, and a little abbreviation that says, well, am I allowed to say fucking here? No, Putin is a head, or go fuck yourself, Putin, basically. And of course, that is something that comes to us from where all great slogans come from, which is European football, or soccer, as we call it, where they start chanting things like that. And it gets written down in this form. Okay, so as you can see from the screen here, that at different times the city of Lvov, or Lviv, I don't know how you want to pronounce it, has been part of many different countries. And so if one lived in this city in the 20th century, you could have your nationality or the state that the country you live in change numerous times without even moving, right? You could be have all these different nationalities. Okay? So here is the city that I'm talking about right here. Okay? And this was not typically part of Ukraine in the 20th century. Okay. There are many issues that Russia faces today. And for Russia, some of the main issues include its sphere of influence and what they call the near abroad. The near abroad refers to those territories that were once a part of the Soviet Union, like Ukraine, like Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Caucasus, Central Asia, as opposed to us, we're the far abroad. But they call them the near abroad. Russia has a demographic crisis in which they are losing somewhere from 500,000 to 750,000 of their population every year. Their population is declining exponentially. And one of the ways in which the Russian government thinks they might be able to stem this hemorrhaging of population is that they look to the ethnic Russians, 25 million of whom live abroad, in the near abroad. Okay? So they are in particular interested in certain parts of Ukraine and other areas that are Russian ethnic Russian dominant. There's also trade and security issues for Russia in the near abroad. By that I mean that Russia's economy was in a large part dependent upon trade with these areas in the near abroad and in Europe in general. And they have security issues in the near abroad, particularly in Ukraine, because they are concerned about the expansion of NATO. They are particularly upset, Russian government, because they thought they had an understanding with us that if they agreed to allow the unification of Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the unification of Germany in 1990, that we would not expand NATO. There was never any formal agreement. It was an understanding. And they thought that we reneged on that. So they were a little bit upset to begin with in this area of outside their borders and between Europe and themselves, because we did expand NATO into several countries that had been part of the Soviet Union or part of the Soviet bloc. And I'll get to that in a moment. Okay. Their sphere of influence is important to them because of the historical record of whether it was Germans or French or others that have invaded them. I mentioned the demographic crisis, and they're concerned about the EU expansion and NATO expansion. As it says here, these territories that were once a part of the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc are now part of the EU. And now this has had a big impact on Russia's economy. They are particularly concerned, even more so than the EU issue, I think, about NATO. And one of the key questions that Mr. Putin and others have raised continuously is, if the Cold War is over, what's NATO's purpose? Is it to contain Russia? And they've never gotten a good answer, because we have seen NATO in action in other areas that the Russians are not particularly happy about in regime change of their allies. Okay. This is what NATO has done in the last couple decades by going after Serbia, who was practicing ethnic cleansing, and then with the creation of Kosovo, over Russia's objections. Regime change in Iraq, regime change in Libya, regime change in Ukraine, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. Although I wouldn't say it was NATO that created the regime change in Ukraine, but it does tie in together. And they're particularly concerned about regime change in Syria. They're really concerned about the extension of the EU and NATO into their sphere of influence in the near abroad. One of the things that in particular the Russians are very concerned about is their trade, which I mentioned before, and their security. Right? Two of the areas. These are not just, the overthrow of Iraq, the government of Iraq, their ally, the overthrow of other governments nearby. Those are annoyances to Russia, but when it comes to Ukraine and the near abroad, that's its vital national interest. And that's something I don't think we understand or are willing to take into consideration. Okay? We act surprised at the outcome of Ukraine when Russia annexed Crimea, or when they go to war against Ukraine, but it's happened before. In fact, Mr. Putin, when he was prime minister, as it says here, even said, look, if Ukraine attempts to join NATO, we will annex those parts of Ukraine that we think we need to. We will protect ourselves. And when Georgia made an attempt to join NATO, that's when Russia and Georgia went to war, right? So it should be no surprise what happened in 2014. Okay, so let's talk about the internal politics of Ukraine for a few minutes. Okay? The president of Ukraine who was overthrown was Mr. Yanukovych, and they were extremely corrupt. It's no secret that they were corrupt. Everybody knew they were corrupt. Everybody everywhere knew they were corrupt, except that their greed was on an unprecedented scale. It was widely perceived that the previous leaders of Ukraine would loot the country in the millions, but these guys were real professionals and looted the country in the billions. It's been calculated that Mr. Yanukovych and his friends stole about half the GDP of Ukraine each year, which is enormous. Because of this massive corruption, a number of politicians sought help from the EU. They saw the EU as a source of a loan of $15 billion, which they needed to cover their budget. And the public was very much in favor of this because they widely perceived the EU as being far less corrupt. I guess they didn't get that EU Commission report that there's massive corruption in the EU as well, which came out in 2014. Or if they did, they ignored it. Okay? Lithuania, in particular, took the lead in trying to work to get Ukraine into the European Union. Okay? It was they made it their mission to try to get Ukraine into the European Union. And what the EU required of Ukraine were economic reforms. They required, they demanded that the Ukrainian government release the former prime minister, Yulia Tymoshenko, who had been jailed as a scapegoat, basically, to try to placate. Yes, she was corrupt, but she wasn't nearly as corrupt as the president himself. And therefore, Europe was really interfering in domestic Ukrainian politics by saying, oh, and by the way, here's the money, but you have to let this person out of jail first. Okay? Well, as it unfolded this way, first the president rejected the EU deal because he was concerned about backlash from Moscow. He tried to broker a deal and say, why can't we get aid from Europe and from Russia? Both. Because the Russians had offered a deal as well. And the EU said no. Either you take our offer and the structural reforms that go with it, or it's no deal. Well, in the end, the president decided that he would return to try to get a better deal from Russia, to try to leverage this European money that was on the table, to try to get a better deal from Russia, and be included in this group along with Belarus and Russia and Kazakhstan. Okay. As 2014 unfolded, you may remember seeing on TV the protest, the massive protest from the Central Square, the Maidan Square in Kiev. The protests turned violent in February when protesters tried to occupy the Parliament building. They were shot at. Many were killed. The government put snipers on rooftops and started shooting into the crowds of people. Something like 100 or so innocent protesters were really murdered by the regime. And in the end, the president relented to the demands. He agreed to what they wanted. That included early presidential elections before his term was up. Okay. Then what happened was truly amazing. The president left Ukraine briefly and turned up in Russia 2 days later. In fact, he went to Belarus and was told he wasn't welcome there, and said, "You have a couple of hours to get the hell out of our country." And so he went to Russia, turned up there. While he left, Parliament voted 328 to nothing to overthrow him, basically. They didn't impeach him. Well, it says to impeach him. That's technically not right. That's a shorthand. They didn't actually bring articles of impeachment against him. They didn't follow a constitutional procedure to impeach him. And in fact, what's not widely talked about is when they voted to oust him, that's a better term, really, that's what happened. They declared the presidency vacant, is what they did. As if presidents are not allowed to leave the country, briefly. But they declared it vacant. They voted that it was vacant. But what's not said is that when they were voting, there were armed, masked men inside the Parliament building to make sure that vote turned out the right way. Right? We don't know exactly who they were, what they represented, but obviously the legislators were intimidated. Can you imagine voting, any legislature voting over 300 to nothing on something like that? I mean, even as corrupt as he was, he had supporters who were intimidated as well. Okay, so they voted to install an interim president and then hold new presidential elections. So, to just sort of back up here for a second, the government was guilty of shooting innocent civilians. The Parliament was intimidated into voting to overthrow the president. Okay. The Russians call it a coup. And I think they have it right. It was a coup. Okay? Some of the key players were the president who was ousted, the acting president, although he was not a key player in this coup, but the key players were some of these guys, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, who on a recording is referred to as Yats, so you'll hear the name Yats. This is who they're referring to. He's currently the prime minister. The Olympic champion, I'm tripping on this, Mr. Klitschko, who on a recording that you'll hear in a moment is referred to as Klitsch. And he is the mayor of Kiev today. Right? Now, a couple of weeks before all of this unfolded, Mr. Kerry, our Secretary of State, is shown here in a State Department photo, meeting with these guys, Klitschko, Yatsenyuk, and Poroshenko, who eventually was elected president. Right? So they're meeting, and one of the key persons here is this lady here, right to the right of Mr. Kerry, who is Victoria Nuland, who is the State Department's European desk person. She's in charge, Undersecretary of State for Europe is what I mean to say. She's the Undersecretary of State for Europe. Okay, so hopefully this will work.
What do you think?
I think we're in play.
Let me just stop it for a second. So she's the Undersecretary of State for Europe. He's our ambassador, Jeffrey, I forget what his last name is. He's our ambassador to Ukraine. Okay? This is a conversation that they didn't take care of securing, and it became public. And I want you to listen very carefully, and then at the end, I'm going to probably replay just a little bit of it and talk about it. This is very important.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as Deputy Prime Minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yacht. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, well, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be trying to vote the big guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. You know, I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Would you want us to try to set up a call with him? Is the next step?
My understanding from that call that you tell me was that the big 3 were going into their own meeting, and that Yats was going to offer in that context a 3-way, you know, 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I mean, that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got. He's probably talking to his guys at this point, so I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the 3, and it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych did that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could let Joey set up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you could just keep. I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we'll probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me via FAR saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deeds to stick. So
Okay.
Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks.
I don't know if everybody got that, but here she is scheming with him, our ambassador, and she's the Undersecretary of State for Europe.
Here we are. NBC begins a new program.
I don't know what this is. Sorry, I don't know where that comes from. I'm going to stop that for a minute. Anyway, I'll just ignore this part. They're deciding who should go into the Ukrainian government, right? I think Yats has the experience, he's got the economic knowledge. I think Klitschko should stay out. It's not going to work. He's got too big of an ego. He can't get along and work with Yatsenyuk. He can't stand to be second. He's got to be the top guy, and so forth. And so there they are deciding, handpicking who's going to be the new leaders of Ukraine, first of all. And then they say, we need to get someone from the UN to help glue this thing together. And in the end, he says, yes, we need someone to help midwife this if it starts to gain altitude, right? Essentially, what they're talking about, it cannot be interpreted any other way than an American coup in Ukraine. Cannot be interpreted any other way. And I can tell you that from the perspective of Russia and the Russians, that this is not only bad enough that it was in their vital national security area, but they must also be thinking, if they can do this in Ukraine, that's just a trial run for regime change in Russia as well. At least if I were Russian, I'd be thinking that. So, did everybody get that part of it? That we need to bring the UN in here to sort of put its blessing on this, right? Okay, let's see if I can get go back here. Okay. Okay. So my answer to that is yes. Okay. The next day after the events, Mr. Obama went on television. President Obama went on television and said to the world, Russia, don't interfere. The Ukrainians have a right to their own self-determination and to choose whomever they want as their leaders. I usually like Obama. I thought this was pretty, what's the word I want to use? Pretty surprising. I think this is very disingenuous.
Good afternoon, everybody. Over the last several days, the United States has been responding to events as they unfold in Ukraine. Throughout this crisis, we have been very clear about one fundamental principle. The Ukrainian people deserve the opportunity to determine their own future. Together with our European allies, we have urged an end to the violence and encouraged Ukrainians to pursue a course in which they stabilize their country, forge a broad-based government, and move to elections this spring. I also spoke several days ago with President Putin, and my administration has been in daily communication with Russian officials. And we've made clear that they can be part of an international community's effort to support the stability and success of a united Ukraine going forward, which is not only in the interest of people of Ukraine and the international community, but also in Russia's interest. However, we are now deeply concerned by reports of military movements taken by the Russian Federation inside of Ukraine. Russia has a historic relationship with Ukraine, including cultural and economic ties, and a military facility in Crimea. But any violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity would be deeply destabilizing, which is not in the interest of Ukraine, Russia, or Europe. It would represent a profound interference in matters that must be determined by the Ukrainian people. It would be a clear violation of Russia's commitment to respect the independence and sovereignty and borders of Ukraine and of international laws. And just days after the world came to Russia for the Olympic Games, it would invite the condemnation of nations around the world. And indeed, the United States will stand with the international community in affirming that there will be costs for any military intervention in Ukraine. The events of the past several months remind us of how difficult democracy can be in a country with deep divisions. But the Ukrainian people have also reminded us that human beings have a universal right to determine their own future. Right now, the situation remains very fluid. Vice President Biden just spoke with the Prime Minister of Ukraine to assure him that in this difficult moment, the United States supports his government's efforts and stands for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and democratic future of Ukraine. I also commend the Ukrainian government's restraint and its commitment to uphold its international obligations. We will continue to coordinate closely with our European allies. We will continue to communicate directly with the Russian government, and we will continue to keep all of you in the press corps and the American people informed as events develop. Thanks very much.
Forces are in Crimea. Are they Russian forces?
So,
Statement by President Obama. We understand he's going to walk across the street.
okay. So, Mr. Obama says Russia should not interfere. That the Ukrainian people have a right to choose their own leaders. Right after we chose the leaders for them.
Earlier this afternoon, the UN Security Council held an emergency session to discuss the political unrest in Ukraine after the closed-door meeting of the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN.
Thank you. Okay, so we know basically what's happened after this, what I would call a coup. Russia seized Crimea. Crimea, as it says here, has been an important Russian base since 1783. That was the time of Catherine the Great. Crimea was transferred to Ukrainian administration in the 1950s by Mr. Khrushchev. Some accounts of that have suggested that he wasn't entirely sober when that happened. But anyway, Mr. Putin made the comment that he didn't want to be greeted by NATO soldiers when he goes to that home base for the Black Sea Fleet. So when they did seize Ukraine, I don't know if I have it after this. Okay, let me just go back here. They had a Russian-style, actually maybe a Soviet-style referendum there. The referendum said, the ballot said, do you want to be part of Russia today or tomorrow? Would you like to be part of Russia now or in the near future? There was no option of, we don't want to be part of Russia in that referendum. So that was the vote that the Russians held up and said, see, the people who live in Crimea want to be part of Russia. Right? Okay. So following that, there was an election for president. Mr. Poroshenko became president. Mr. Poroshenko is a billionaire. Now, I have nothing against billionaires, I suppose. It's the same argument what they elected him like same argument that people use when they talk about Donald Trump, he can't be bought, or other wealthy politicians, former mayor of New York City, can't be bought, he's already a billionaire. And so they elected Mr. Poroshenko. On the theory, I think a lot of people voted for him because they thought, well, what does he have to steal from the state for, like these other leaders? He's already wealthy, he's already a billionaire. I don't know how easy it is to make $1 billion. I suppose it's not that easy. I haven't done it yet. But seems to me that in a country that did not have a market economy until the 1990s, that if you can acquire $1 billion in that little period of time, in less than 20 years, you're probably cutting corners somewhere, right? As many of the Russian billionaires said, my first million wasn't clean, but I swear to you, all the money I made after that is. So I suspect that that's probably the case with Mr. Poroshenko. He owned or owns candy factories, chocolate factories in Russia and other places. Sorry, so I don't know how you make $1 billion selling chocolate. Okay, vodka I can understand, but chocolate, okay. So in October 14, there were parliamentary elections, and the new legislature presented to the president this plan to go back to the EU and try to regain that trade agreement that they had not taken before. And more recently, Mr. Poroshenko has said, this was at the time that the fighting was particularly heavy in those breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine, that we are going to make a push for joining NATO. We're going to make the changes we need to make, and we're going to try to join NATO. Extremely provocative statement on his part. So, as you can see, we've sort of come full circle, right, with a new president who's going back to the policies that sort of got them in trouble, caused a lot of conflict in the first place, of Ukraine opting for an EU and a NATO tilt. Okay. If we understand what Ukraine is like today, ethnically speaking, here in these areas in the Donetsk and Crimean region, there's more than 90% ethnically Russian. In Luhansk, it's probably 70%. And these are the two areas that there was no election. They didn't hold the election in these areas. Okay? And what I want you to gain from this map to understand is that in these areas here, right, in the darker shaded areas, it's what I said at the beginning, that Eastern Ukraine is ethnically Russian, and they're the same people as the Russians. They speak the same language, they have the same culture, the same religion, the same, in many ways, they're the same people. But Western Ukraine is a whole different area. Western Ukraine, with its influence from Poland and Lithuania, is Catholic. It's westernized. It's unlike Eastern Ukraine, which is Russian Orthodox or Ukrainian Orthodox, and have a Cyrillic alphabet. Western Ukraine, historically, as part of Poland or Lithuania, would have a different a Western alphabet and so forth. Okay. Now, what is Ukraine's future? Half of Ukraine still favors closer ties with Russia. Half of Ukraine favors closer ties with the EU and Europe and NATO. All of this, I would argue, is the unintended consequence of the Soviet Union pushing Ukraine's borders as far as they could after World War II. Right? So, the country could break up into two or more states, one state joining with Russia, one state joining with EU. It could remain as a whole, as a buffer state, which personally I think is what should happen, but they don't consult me, at least they haven't yet. I just want to spend a second talking about this option here. As a buffer state between Russia and the West, not aligned with the EU and NATO, and not necessarily aligned with Russia in any kind of military or other agreement or economic agreement either. And from my perspective, that would be the optimal choice. But like I said, Mr. Poroshenko doesn't have my number. One of the unintended consequences of this that no one really talks about, because everyone thinks that Mr. Putin is invincible, and the latest edition of Foreign Affairs talks about coined the term Putin envy in the West, and there's a question in my mind that if Ukraine does break up and part of it goes to the EU, or if Ukraine stays together as Mr. Poroshenko wants, and it becomes part of the EU and part of NATO, a certain group of Russian political leaders are going to talk about who lost Ukraine. And we know who lost Ukraine. Mr. Putin lost Ukraine, and while, again, Mr. Putin appears to be invincible, Russia has this way of having things happen that catches us by surprise, whether it's the collapse of the Soviet Union, or even the Russian Revolution in 1917, or other kinds of events that happen. Russia always seems to surprise us. The overthrow of Khrushchev would be another example. And if Mr. Putin, I spend a lot of time thinking about this. I'm really kind of a boring guy. I think about this a lot. Like, who's going to come after Putin? And from my perspective, if Mr. Putin were to be replaced, I don't think we would like it very much. I think it would be someone who would be much more hostile to Ukraine, much more hostile to the West, someone who we probably couldn't get along with very easily. Interestingly, just yesterday, or was it this morning, Mr. Putin said in a news conference that the West and Russia needs to put aside its differences. That's code words for this, right? Needs to put aside its differences. In other words, let's end the sanctions against Russia because we imposed economic sanctions over Crimea. And he said, we need to focus on fighting ISIS in the Middle East. After their plane was bombed last week or recently in Egypt, and with the attacks in Paris and so forth, what Mr. Putin is now saying, well, actually, he's been saying it now for 15 years, that Islamic terrorism, Islamic extremism is the enemy. It's not us, Russia. It's not the West. We should put aside our differences. And whether that happens or not, of course, remains to be seen. I don't think that will happen very easily, but this is what he's talking about. This event is extremely important to Russia, but I think now he's saying we need to get beyond this and work together in a way that we haven't seen in generations. So that's this is my last slide. In conclusion, I would say from my perspective, Russia didn't start this crisis in Ukraine. I would blame the Europeans for this. Lithuania, who conned Germany into going along, who conned the United States into going along in this scheme. We managed to pull off a coup d'etat in Ukraine, but Russia still has issues in this area. They may very well incorporate eastern Ukraine, those two areas that I showed you on the map. They may go after other areas as well. And my advice would be not to provoke Russia and not to expect a reaction as if Mr. Obama just simply going on TV and sort of wagging his finger at the Russians and say, don't interfere now. That wouldn't be good for international law. So anyway, that's my conclusion, and thank you for listening. And I'll be happy to take questions. Now it closes. I'll be happy to take questions if there are any. I know. You want to know where I bought this? Where the shopping will be. Yes, please.
What about the sovereignty piece? Your point about what the future holds for Ukraine and the options that it has, and your suggestion that it should just be a buffer zone. Doesn't Ukraine have the right to self-determination? And doesn't, I mean, frankly, from the perspective of the Ukrainian government, Russia's economy is in steep decline. It made up close to 10% of the world economy during the Cold War. Now it's less than 3%. And also NATO makes sense so the EU makes sense because that NATO is starting to make more sense because Russia invaded the Crimea and is in Donetsk and Luhansk and all over the east. So doesn't it make sense for Ukraine to be able to make its own decisions?
Sure, that's one way of looking at it, and I would say theoretically, yes, that Ukraine should be sovereign, but at the point at which there's sovereignty and those kinds of decisions infringe upon Russia's security, I think that Russia has a legitimate interest in what Ukraine does as well, because of NATO right up to their border. Russia's economy is in a deep downturn, mostly because of the price of oil has collapsed. Economic sanctions have begun to be felt, and there are many Western politicians who are saying what you are. We should arm Ukraine. We should. Well, you didn't say that, but I mean, as a prelude to Ukraine joining NATO. I know you didn't say that. And your point was about Ukraine's sovereignty. But I think that in the name of sovereignty, that it only goes so far. If Canada were to, in the name of sovereignty, do something that threatened the United States, invite China to have a military base, have a naval base somewhere, we might object to it, just as I think Russia would object to NATO in Ukraine.
Follow? I would just say, like, I understand Russia's interest in having Ukraine not be part of either of those institutions, but the world order that we have created by the sort of framework of the UN and the norms that countries have to adhere to doesn't allow Russian interests to govern Ukrainian policy.
Theoretically. That's not the real world. That happens all the time in the real world. Just like China tells other countries what to do, even other sovereign countries. Just like the United States tells other countries what to do, even other sovereign countries. Yes, please.
So when you say that it would be optimal for the Ukraine to be a buffer state, are you saying that in terms of the United States' national security interests and Russia's, or one or the other?
I'm saying that primarily in terms of Russian and European national interests, European Union national interests. The United States tangentially as a NATO member, but not primarily. Yes, please.
So, to that point, I understand the mistakes that have been made up until this point by the U.S. and by Europe. But what should they do now? Like, what would be your recommendation for Europe or for the U.S. to do in taking the steps for Ukraine to become a buffer state?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question because I know the answer. and my answer would be get out and stay the hell out of Ukraine's internal politics. It's not our backyard. It's Russia's backyard. And I think we should get out and stay the hell out.
But if we were to get out and stay out at this point, how would you see that affecting America's resolve and kind of perception in the international community, and therefore their ability to project power in the future?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's not like Ukraine is a close ally. It's not as if we have a treaty with Ukraine. I don't think it would have any impact on our resolve. And right now, the European Union is in turmoil over so many other things, from migrants to the Greek economy, which no one talks about anymore, and terrorism, that the Europeans would be probably relieved to be given a pass to forget about Ukraine for a couple of years. Yes.
Let's say that hypothetically we do get out of Ukraine and then Russia takes Ukraine, the entirety of Ukraine.
Takes the entirety, swallows it up, the whole thing?
Yes, just takes it back into Russia. Then what kind of a risk would that pose to EU, NATO, and then the US?
Sure. From my perspective, the risk would be none, zero. I don't see that happening. I suppose it could. I think, theoretically it could. What would be more likely would be a kind of closer economic union, say between Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, or Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, maybe. Rather than the outright absorption of Ukraine. But even if that were to happen, it's not like they're going to go after the Czech Republic or Slovakia or Germany or Poland or any other country after that. Putin may be a homicidal psycho, but he's not stupid, and he's not spoiling for a war with the West.
Isn't that what Neville Chamberlain said?
Yeah.
I don't think those were his words.
No.
No, but I understand what you're saying. I understand the parallel. Yes, I understand the parallel. Go ahead, follow.
And then how would you also consider Russia's intentions when you take into account it recently had submarines near all of the U.S. data cables that I think it's like billions of dollars and 95% of the internet goes over.
Yeah, they were lost.
Were they?
Yeah.
Were they lost? I don't know. I always wonder.
Sure, they're being provocative. I mean, you know, Russian submarines turn up in Sweden's territorial waters on a regular basis. Their jets test our responses over our airspace, or right up to our airspace. They test our responses in all kinds of ways. And yes, they're clumsy, and they could, you know, they're the bear. They're clumsy. You know, they could easily have severed those cables, and oops, you know, unintentionally. I don't think it was their intention to damage them. Yeah. Yes.
I mean, I actually agree with you that Russia's not
Ooh,
a threat to Western Europe and the United States. I don't think it has even if it has the desire to expand,
doesn't have the capability.
it doesn't have the resources
Absolutely.
or any of that jazz, or especially political allies. But the other issue that I had was with your description of sort of the coup d'etat.
Sure.
And what did happen in Ukraine, actually in a lot of ways, in Crimea, resembled in a lot of ways what you described when Yanukovych, when he came to power. So in Crimea, you had the day after Yanukovych fled, Putin had a meeting and concluded that it was time to start returning Crimea to Russia.
Yeah.
And 4 days after that, he had Russian troops seize the Supreme Council of Crimea and,
Right.
and the equivalent in Simferopol. So they basically took over Crimea through the same tactics, and it's not just a coup; it's an invasion in that case. So in what way do they have the upper moral hand from the perspective of anyone that's not Russia? And also, really, why does it make sense for Russia to want to take this territory? The economic repercussions of its actions have been devastating, and Crimea in particular is a region that doesn't produce anything productive in terms of economic output. So Russia's not making any money. It's going to cost them billions of dollars to
Investment,
float.
yeah,
So why are they
sure.
doing it?
Yeah, strategic location. It's the home of the Black Sea Naval Base, and has been since the 1780s. And it's and that's what's important to them. Don't forget, right? This is you know, I say this all the time. I didn't say it here today, but I'll say it now. In the absence of free and fair and competitive elections, what provides legitimacy to the Russian government is their place in the world and on the world stage. And if they're being pushed around by Ukraine and not striking back and not taking what they consider legitimately to be theirs, then the government has no legitimacy, like the Yeltsin government in the 1990s that was perceived to be weak and on its knees and begging for a handout from the West in terms of foreign aid. Now, to your other point, I don't think they have the high moral ground. I don't think they do. But I think that they have legitimate security interests that we need to take into consideration. And we haven't done that. We've never done that. And I think it's about time that we do. As the Russians said, what is the purpose of NATO? Is it to be anti-Russian? I mean, if the Cold War is over, the Cold War is over, isn't it? Maybe not. Maybe not. Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about your description of the coup.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, I don't know, it brought me back to a conversation that I had with actually a Colgate alum, Arnaldez, who is like a special advisor to the European Parliament President, Schultz. And he was saying how he was very much at the table in discussions of like who was going to be the next president, and like how they talked about how Poroshenko was like good at economics, and it kind of, I was wondering what your thoughts were on the involvement of like EU leaders or European policymakers in this kind of coup that you described that American
They got cold
officials-
feet. they got cold feet, and that's why you heard the Undersecretary of State say what she said. You
So
know,
do you think it was from an strictly American side, or were EU officials also very involved?
I think the EU got the ball rolling, got the idea going, and then they got cold feet. And then the United States picked up the ball and ran with it, so to speak, and carried it out. And as they said on there, with the help of the United Nations, to glue this thing together, right, and to midwife this thing, meaning the coup, right? And as she said, you know, to the FU, to the EU, sorry, FU to the EU. And because I think the EU officials literally got cold feet and weren't willing to go through with it. And the reason why is because Angela Merkel was afraid of Russian-German trade being hurt. You know, Germany is the biggest exporting country in the world after China, and a lot of their exports go to Russia. And something like this isn't good for German business. They want to have good relations with Russia. Yes, please.
What do you see as the implications of this crisis on the behavior of other states in Russia's near abroad? And like, what would be the fallout if they started looking west?
Well, I think we saw what happened in Georgia. Georgia had openly discussed and made plans to join, to become a partner of NATO. And that's when Russia said, no, you've crossed the line. Did you have other states in mind? Because I can tell you, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania already are part of NATO and part of the EU. Belarus and its leader, Mr. Lukashenko, has this delusional idea of ruling all of Russia. And Belarus and Russia have been together for forever anyway. So what else are we talking about? Armenia, Azerbaijan? I don't think they're going to do anything that would antagonize Russia. Central Asia, not likely either. Russia has pretty good, as far as I know, relations with Kazakhstan, and still try to exercise a lot of influence in the other countries of the near abroad of Central Asia. So, to answer your question is, I don't think that they are going to challenge Russia in that way that Ukraine has, or that Europe has in Ukraine. I don't see it. Yes.
Wondering if you view the current situation in Ukraine as kind of a continuation of the Orange Revolution, in that this is like a long kind of, I don't know, story maybe?
Yeah, a 10-year saga. Well, the reforms were incomplete in the Orange Revolution. They did a lot of backsliding, still a lot of corruption. That is a pretty good way of looking at it,
I mean,
as a continuation. Yeah, as a continuation. Now open, now hidden conflict for the future of Ukraine. I would like that way of formulating it. I would agree with that. Do we have time to go over the Orange Revolution? No, okay. Are there more questions of council? Yes, Mr. Chernoff.
Just following up on some of the other questions about the coup. I mean, you're placing security-driven decision-making as, you know, much higher priority over legitimacy in international law and so forth. And this seems to have been not a constitutional transition, right? Pretty clearly, not a constitutional transition.
I would say that that's true. I would argue that.
But then, excuse me. But then, given that it's not constitutional and maybe a coup, you were kind of leaving open in this talk what the role of the U.S. was in bringing it about, as opposed to shaping it once once you have an ousted leader, what happens next? And so could you address that, what the role of the U.S. was?
Leading up to this?
Leading up to the ouster as opposed to the aftermath.
Okay, yes, I can do that. I'd be happy to do that. I think the United States played a big role in events since 2004 and this Orange Revolution. The United States spent $5 billion in Ukraine trying to create the conditions of a market economy and democracy. Okay? Now, one of the things that I think that the United States did do was help to create the conditions that led to the coup by encouraging the demonstrators who were there since November 2013, who stayed out in Ukrainian winters day after day. I think a lot of that $5 billion was distributed in 2013 to sort of, here's some foreign aid for Ukraine. I think the United States spent money in Ukraine to help foment popular unrest that resulted in the mass demonstrations, that resulted in them being shot up, that resulted in the coup d'etat. And I think we did so with the sort of backing and approval and the go get them from the European Union. So I would say we were deeply complicit beforehand as well as after. And that $5 billion figure I got is from the Undersecretary of State for Europe in another speech that she made that I didn't include in this, but you can find it online, where she's bragging about how we spent $5 billion since the Orange Revolution on helping Ukraine transition to a market economy and democracy, meaning we spent that money to buy influence, or at least rent influence.
Well, if there are no other questions at this time, please join me in thanking Professor Richardson.